The morning sun cast long shadows across the small downtown office building, where Marcus Chen worked as a records clerk. He had been at this job for 3 years now, filing documents, assisting visitors, and maintaining the municipal archives with quiet dedication. Most people barely noticed him behind his desk, and that suited Marcus just fine. He preferred the peaceful routine of his work to any sort of drama or attention. On this particular Tuesday, Marcus arrived at 7:30 as usual, unlocking the heavy glass doors and switching on the fluorescent lights that hummed to life overhead. He prepared his workspace methodically, arranging his pens in a neat row, booting up his computer and reviewing the day's scheduled appointments. 3 people were expected that morning to retrieve various records and permits, simple, straightforward tasks that Marcus could handle with ease. The first visitor arrived just after 8 o'clock. Mrs. Patterson needed a copy of her late husband's property deed, and Marcus located it within minutes, making the copy and having her sign the release form. She thanked him warmly before shuffling out the door. The second appointment was a young couple applying for a business license, which Marcus processed efficiently while explaining each step of the approval process. It was nearly 10 o'clock when the third visitor arrived, and everything changed. The front door swung open with such force that it banged against the wall, making Marcus look up sharply from his keyboard. A tall man in a crisp military uniform strode through the entrance, his boots striking the tile floor with aggressive purpose. The insignia on his shoulder marked him as Sergeant Dale Hutchinson, and everything about his bearing suggested he was accustomed to immediate obedience and deference. Sergeant Hutchinson approached the counter without greeting, slapping a folded piece of paper onto the desk surface. His jaw was set in a hard line, and his eyes surveyed the small office as if assessing enemy territory. Marcus recognized the type immediately from his brief time in customer service training. This was someone who believed rank and volume could solve any problem. Marcus looked at the paper, then up at the sergeant with his characteristic, calm expression. The document was a request for expedited processing of multiple permits and certificates, along with a demand to waive all associated fees. The signature at the bottom was barely legible, and there was no official authorization stamp or approval code that would normally accompany such a request. The sergeant leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the counter. His voice was low but carried an unmistakable edge of threat. He explained that he needed these documents processed immediately, that he had important military business to attend to, and that a simple clerk should not waste his valuable time with bureaucratic nonsense. The implication was clear. Marcus should simply do as he was told without question or hesitation. Marcus remained perfectly still, his face betraying no emotion. He picked up the paper and examined it more closely, taking his time to read through each line. The sergeant's jaw tightened with visible irritation at this delay. Around them, the office seemed to hold its breath. A colleague named Sarah who worked in the adjacent cubicle had stopped typing, sensing the tension building in the air. After a long moment, Marcus set the paper down gently and looked directly at Sergeant Hutchinson. His voice when he spoke was quiet, professional, and utterly composed. He explained that he would be happy to help process these requests, but that he would need to see the proper authorization from the commanding officer's office. Without that documentation, he could not waive the fees or expedite the processing beyond the standard timeline. The rules applied equally to everyone, regardless of rank or position. The sergeant's face flushed red. His hands curled into fists on the countertop, and for a moment it seemed he might actually reach across and grab Marcus by his collar. Instead, he straightened up to his full height, which was considerable, and began speaking in a voice that grew steadily louder. He questioned Marcus's intelligence, his competence, and his understanding of who exactly he was dealing with. Did Marcus not understand that a military sergeant outranked a simple civilian clerk? Did he not grasp that obstacles could be removed when they became inconvenient? Marcus waited for the sergeant to finish, never breaking eye contact, never showing the slightest hint of fear or anger. When silence finally fell, he repeated his earlier statement in the exact same calm tone. He needed proper authorization. The rules existed for good reasons. He would be glad to help once the correct documentation was provided. There was no defensiveness in his voice, no challenge. Just a simple statement of fact delivered with unshakable composure. What Sergeant Hutchinson did not know, what no one in that office knew except perhaps Sarah, who had worked with Marcus the longest, was that Marcus had spent 6 years in the military himself before returning to civilian life. He had served in some of the most high-pressure situations imaginable, learning to keep his head clear when others around him panicked. He had seen officers like Hutchinson before, men who confused authority with bullying, who thought loudness equaled leadership. The confrontation was only beginning, but Marcus already understood something the sergeant did not. This was not going to be resolved through intimidation or shortcuts. Whatever happened next, Marcus would not be moved from his position. The rules existed to protect everyone, and he would uphold them regardless of who stood on the other side of his desk. His calm was not weakness. It was strength that had been tested and proven in far more dangerous circumstances than this office could ever present. The sergeant was about to learn a lesson that no amount of shouting could overcome. Sergeant Hutchinson took a step back from the counter, his chest heaving with barely controlled rage. His face had progressed from red to a deeper shade of crimson, and a vein pulsed visibly at his temple. For several seconds he simply stared at Marcus, as if unable to believe that this ordinary-looking clerk in his simple button-down shirt and glasses had just refused him. Twice. Marcus remained seated, his hands folded calmly on the desk in front of him. He did not fidget, did not look away, did not show any of the nervous tells that the sergeant was clearly waiting to see. Behind him, Sarah had resumed typing, but Marcus could sense that she was listening to every word, ready to intervene if things escalated beyond words. The sergeant changed tactics. His voice dropped to what he probably imagined was a more reasonable tone, though it still carried unmistakable condescension. He explained slowly, as if speaking to a child, that Marcus was making a very serious mistake. The sergeant had connections, important friends in the municipal government. He could make life very difficult for a clerk who chose to be uncooperative. Perhaps Marcus did not understand how easily people in his position could be replaced. Marcus allowed a small, patient smile to touch the corners of his mouth. He acknowledged that the sergeant might indeed have important connections. He did not doubt that at all. However, those connections would certainly understand that proper procedures had to be followed. In fact, people with real authority and influence typically appreciated employees who followed the rules correctly, as it protected everyone involved from potential legal issues or accusations of favoritism. The logic of this statement clearly caught Sergeant Hutchinson off guard. His mouth opened, then closed again. He had expected fear or anger, either of which he could have used to his advantage. Instead, Marcus had simply agreed with him in a way that completely deflated his threat, while simultaneously standing firm on the original requirement. From across the office, the door to the supervisor's office opened. David Martinez, the office manager, emerged with a concerned expression. He had heard the raised voices and come to investigate. David was in his 50s, a career bureaucrat who valued peace and efficiency above almost everything else. The sight of a military sergeant in full uniform glaring at one of his clerks was clearly not what he wanted to deal with on a Tuesday morning. David approached with his hands slightly raised in a placating gesture, already smiling in a way that suggested he was prepared to smooth over whatever misunderstanding had occurred. He greeted the sergeant warmly, thanked him for his service, and asked how the office could help him today. His tone implied that whatever the problem was, it could surely be resolved quickly with a bit of cooperation from everyone involved. Sergeant Hutchinson seized on this new arrival like a lifeline. He immediately launched into his complaint, painting Marcus as an obstinate and disrespectful employee who refused to provide basic assistance to a member of the armed forces. He gestured dramatically at the paperwork on the counter, his voice rising again as he described the urgent nature of his needs and the unreasonable barriers this clerk had erected. David listened with an increasingly worried expression, nodding sympathetically and shooting uncomfortable glances at Marcus. When the sergeant finished, David picked up the paperwork and examined it. Marcus watched his supervisor carefully, knowing that this was the critical moment. Would David take the easy path and simply override the rules to make the angry customer go away, or would he support his employee in upholding the correct procedures? David cleared his throat. He assured the sergeant that there must be some way to resolve the situation. He valued the military service greatly. However, as he reviewed the documents, his expression grew more troubled. He looked at Marcus, then back at the sergeant. With obvious reluctance, he admitted that Marcus was actually correct. The waiver of fees and expedited processing did require authorization from a superior officer. It was not something he could override, even as office manager. The policy came from higher up in the municipal chain of command. The sergeant's face went through a remarkable transformation. The confident aggression drained away, replaced first by disbelief, then by a calculating hardness. He snatched the papers back from David's hand and stuffed them into his uniform pocket. His voice when he spoke was cold and precise. He informed both of them that this was not over. He would be filing complaints with their superiors, possibly with the mayor's office itself. They would both regret choosing to be difficult with the wrong person. Marcus finally spoke again, his voice as calm as it had been from the beginning. He suggested that perhaps the sergeant could simply visit his commanding officer's administrative office this afternoon. They could provide the proper authorization in a matter of minutes, and Marcus would be happy to process everything first thing tomorrow morning. The entire process would likely take less than an hour of the sergeant's time. It was not a barrier, just a proper procedure. This practical solution, delivered without any hint of smugness or victory, seemed to infuriate Sergeant Hutchinson more than anything else that had been said. He clearly wanted this to be a battle, a conflict where he could assert dominance and prove his superiority. Marcus's persistent reasonableness robbed him of that satisfaction, turning what should have been a simple power dynamic into an actual procedural requirement that even his rank could not override. The sergeant turned on his heel and strode toward the door with the same aggressive energy he had brought in with. Just before leaving, he turned back and pointed directly at Marcus. He promised, in a voice that carried throughout the entire office, that Marcus would pay for this embarrassment. One way or another, there would be consequences for making a military officer look foolish. Then he was gone, the door slamming behind him hard enough to rattle the glass in its frame. The office fell into stunned silence. Sarah stopped pretending to type and simply stared at Marcus. David stood frozen, the color slowly draining from his face as he realized the situation he had just witnessed, and tacitly supported Marcus. Calmly turned back to his computer and resumed the task he had been working on before the interruption. His hands did not shake. His breathing remained steady. To anyone watching, he appeared completely unaffected by the confrontation, as if angry sergeants threatened him every day and it meant nothing at all. But Marcus knew something that neither the departed sergeant nor his worried supervisor understood. The real challenge was not over. It was just beginning. The rest of Tuesday passed in an atmosphere of uncomfortable tension. David retreated to his office immediately after the sergeant's departure and did not emerge for the remainder of the morning. Through the glass walls of his office, Marcus could see him on the phone multiple times, his expression growing increasingly anxious with each conversation. Sarah approached Marcus's desk during lunch, concern evident in her eyes. She asked quietly if he was okay, if he realized how serious that confrontation might become. Sergeant Hutchinson had not seemed like the type of person to let things go. Marcus thanked her for her concern and assured her that he had simply followed the correct procedures. There was nothing to worry about. Even as he said it, though, he understood that Sarah's worry was not entirely unfounded. Wednesday morning arrived with deceptive calm. Marcus went through his usual routine, organizing his workspace and preparing for the day ahead. David emerged from his office around 9 o'clock, walked directly to Marcus's desk and requested a private meeting. His voice was formal, carefully neutral, which immediately told Marcus everything he needed to know about what was coming. In David's office, the supervisor sat heavily in his chair and rubbed his temples as if fighting off a headache. He began by saying that he understood Marcus had followed the proper procedures yesterday. He was not questioning that decision. However, there had been complications. Sergeant Hutchinson had indeed followed through on his threat to file complaints, and he had been remarkably thorough in doing so. The complaints had gone to multiple departments within the municipal government, each one painting Marcus as disrespectful to military personnel, unnecessarily bureaucratic, and potentially discriminatory against service members. The sergeant had found sympathetic ears in several places, particularly among officials who valued maintaining positive relationships with the military base located just outside the city limits. David explained that he had received calls from 3 different department heads, all asking why his clerk had caused trouble with a military sergeant over what they perceived as minor procedural issues. One had strongly suggested that Marcus should be counseled about the importance of flexibility in customer service. Another had implied that perhaps Marcus was not suited for a position that required interaction with the public. Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful, but not worried. When David finished, Marcus asked a simple question. Had any of these department heads actually reviewed the specific regulations that governed fee waivers and expedited processing? David hesitated, then admitted that he did not believe so. They were responding to the complaint itself, not investigating the underlying procedures. This admission hung in the air between them. David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He said that regardless of who was technically correct, the political pressure was real. The mayor's office was asking questions. The military liaison was getting involved. Things were escalating beyond a simple dispute over paperwork. He asked Marcus if he might be willing to apologize to the sergeant, to smooth things over and make this situation go away before it damaged both of their careers. Marcus considered this carefully. He understood the political reality David was describing. Government offices ran on relationships and goodwill as much as on rules and procedures. Making powerful people angry, even when you were completely in the right, could have lasting consequences. A simple apology might indeed resolve everything quickly and allow them all to move forward. But Marcus also understood something deeper. If he apologized now, he would be setting a precedent. He would be teaching Sergeant Hutchinson, and anyone else who witnessed this situation, that rules could be bypassed through intimidation and complaint rather than proper channels. The next clerk who tried to uphold procedures might find themselves in an even worse position because Marcus had backed down. Marcus told David that he appreciated the difficult position his supervisor was in. He did not want to cause problems for the office or for David personally. However, he could not apologize for correctly following established procedures. If the department heads had concerns about those procedures, they should review and potentially change them. But as long as the rules existed, Marcus would continue to apply them fairly and consistently to everyone who came through that door. David's face fell. He had clearly hoped that Marcus would take the easier path. He warned that this decision might not end well for Marcus. The sergeant seemed determined to cause trouble, and he had found allies in his campaign. There were ways that Marcus's job could be made difficult or even eliminated without directly firing him. Budget cuts, position eliminations, restructuring of departments. The bureaucracy had many tools for removing problematic employees. Marcus nodded calmly. He understood the risks, but he also believed that if he lost his job for correctly following the rules, that said more about the system than it did about him. He would face whatever consequences came with the knowledge that he had acted with integrity. Some things mattered more than job security. The meeting ended shortly after, with David looking both frustrated and grudgingly impressed. As Marcus returned to his desk, he found Sarah waiting with 2 cups of coffee. She had clearly been anxious during his absence, and her relief at seeing him return was evident. She told him quietly that she admired what he was doing, even if she thought it might be career suicide. Thursday brought new developments. Sergeant Hutchinson returned to the office, but this time he was not alone. He arrived with another military officer, a Captain Morrison, who introduced himself politely and asked to speak with both Marcus and David. The captain's demeanor was completely different from the sergeant's. He was professional, courteous, and seemed genuinely interested in understanding what had transpired. In David's office, the 4 of them sat down together. Captain Morrison began by apologizing for any inconvenience or unpleasantness. He explained that he was the sergeant's commanding officer, and he had heard about the situation through official channels. He wanted to understand exactly what had happened and what was needed to resolve the matter appropriately. Marcus explained the situation clearly and factually, without embellishment or emotion. He detailed the request, the missing authorization, and the regulatory requirements that governed such requests. He showed Captain Morrison the relevant policy documents, walking him through each applicable section. Throughout this explanation, Sergeant Hutchinson sat silently, his face growing progressively more uncomfortable. When Marcus finished, Captain Morrison nodded slowly. He turned to the sergeant and asked why he had not simply come to the administrative office for the proper authorization in the first place. The sergeant stammered something about being too busy, about thinking the authorization was unnecessary for such minor requests. His earlier confidence and aggression had completely evaporated under his commanding officer's steady gaze. Captain Morrison's response was quiet, but devastating. He explained that proper procedure was not optional, that attempting to bypass regulations reflected poorly on the entire military base, and that filing multiple complaints against a civilian employee for correctly doing his job was completely unacceptable behavior. The captain's disappointment was evident in every word. The room fell silent. David looked stunned. Marcus maintained his calm expression, though he felt a wave of vindication wash over him. Sergeant Hutchinson stared at his hands, unable or unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. The tide had just turned, and everyone in that room knew it. Captain Morrison continued speaking, his words measured but carrying unmistakable authority. He stated clearly that Sergeant Hutchinson would be withdrawing all complaints filed against Marcus immediately. Furthermore, the sergeant would be providing a written apology to both Marcus and David for the disruption and unprofessional conduct. The captain made it clear this was not a request but a direct order. Sergeant Hutchinson's jaw clenched, but he nodded stiffly. The transformation from the aggressive, threatening figure who had stormed into the office on Tuesday to this subdued, chastened man was remarkable. All his bluster and intimidation had crumbled when confronted by genuine authority that demanded accountability, rather than simply accepting his version of events. David found his voice, thanking the captain profusely for coming in person to address the situation. He assured the captain that the office had always valued its relationship with the military base and hoped this incident would not damage that partnership. His relief was palpable. The political pressure that had been weighing on him suddenly lifted by this unexpected turn of events. Captain Morrison turned to Marcus directly. He apologized for the sergeant's behavior and thanked Marcus for maintaining professionalism throughout what must have been a very difficult confrontation. He added something that made Marcus respect him immediately. The captain said that employees who upheld proper procedures, even under pressure, were valuable assets to any organization. The military relied on people following protocols correctly, and he appreciated seeing that same commitment in the civilian sector. Marcus accepted the apology gracefully, stating that he understood mistakes could happen, and that he appreciated the captain taking the time to investigate the situation thoroughly. He did not gloat or show any satisfaction at the sergeant's obvious discomfort. His response was as measured and professional as everything else he had done throughout this entire affair. As they all stood to leave David's office, Captain Morrison paused and asked Marcus a question that surprised everyone. He inquired whether Marcus had any military background. Something about the way Marcus had handled himself under pressure, the calm composure and unwillingness to be intimidated, suggested prior service. Marcus confirmed that he had served 6 years in the Army before returning to civilian life. He had reached the rank of staff sergeant before deciding he wanted a quieter existence. Captain Morrison nodded as if this explained everything. He remarked that it showed in the way Marcus conducted himself. Then, with a slight smile, he added that Sergeant Hutchinson might have approached the situation very differently had he known he was trying to intimidate a fellow veteran. The sergeant's face flushed again, but this time with embarrassment rather than anger. The realization that he had been attempting to bully someone with more military experience and equal rank to his own clearly stung. His entire strategy had been based on the assumption that Marcus was simply a timid civilian clerk who could be pushed around. Learning the truth undermined every interaction they had had. After Captain Morrison and Sergeant Hutchinson departed, David closed his office door and sat down heavily in his chair once again. He looked at Marcus with an expression that mixed relief, amazement, and a touch of embarrassment. He admitted that he had been preparing to ask Marcus to consider transferring to a different department to resolve the political pressure. The thought of potentially losing a good employee over this had troubled him, but the pressure from above had been intense. Marcus understood. He told David that he did not blame him for considering that option. Political realities were part of any government job, and supervisors had to balance many competing interests. What mattered was that David had ultimately supported him in the meeting, backing up Marcus's explanation of the procedures rather than undermining him. David then asked the question that had clearly been bothering him. Why had Marcus not mentioned his military background earlier? It might have diffused the entire situation if the sergeant had known from the beginning. Marcus's answer was simple but profound. His military service was part of his past, but it did not define his current role. He was a records clerk now, and he wanted to be respected for doing that job well, not for what he had done years ago. Every person who came to his counter deserved the same fair treatment regardless of whether Marcus had worn a uniform or not. This response seemed to strike David deeply. He nodded slowly, a new appreciation evident in his expression. He told Marcus that the office was lucky to have him, and that he would be making sure the department heads who had been pressuring him understood what had actually happened. There would be no negative consequences from this incident, and David would be documenting everything to protect Marcus if any future issues arose. Friday brought a surprising development. Sergeant Hutchinson returned to the office one final time, and his entire demeanor had changed completely. Gone was the aggressive posture, the loud voice, the intimidating bearing. He approached Marcus's counter quietly, almost hesitantly, carrying a manila folder. The sergeant placed the folder on the counter and met Marcus's eyes with obvious difficulty. Inside was the properly authorized request for fee waivers and expedited processing, complete with Captain Morrison's signature and the official command seal. Everything was in perfect order, exactly as Marcus had explained it needed to be from the very beginning. Sergeant Hutchinson also handed Marcus a handwritten letter. It was the formal apology Captain Morrison had ordered, but reading it revealed something more than just compliance with a direct order. The sergeant acknowledged that he had been wrong to try to bypass proper procedures. He admitted that he had let his impatience and sense of entitlement override his better judgment. He apologized not just for the confrontation, but for attempting to make Marcus's job harder through complaints and political pressure. Marcus read the letter carefully, then looked up at the sergeant. He accepted the apology and the properly submitted paperwork. He told Sergeant Hutchinson that he would have everything processed by the end of the day and available for pickup on Monday morning. The standard processing timeline, followed correctly, would have everything ready with no problems. Something passed between them in that moment. It was not quite friendship or even mutual respect yet, but it was an acknowledgement. The sergeant recognized that Marcus had never been trying to create obstacles or assert power over him. Marcus had simply been doing his job correctly, protecting both of them from potential complications that could have arisen from improper procedures. The sergeant nodded and turned to leave. But before reaching the door, he paused and looked back. He said something that Marcus would remember for a long time afterward. He thanked Marcus for not backing down, even when it would have been easier to do so. The sergeant admitted that he had needed to learn that lesson, and Marcus had taught it with more patience and professionalism than he probably deserved. After the sergeant left, Sarah came over to Marcus's desk with a huge smile. She told him that she had witnessed the entire evolution of this situation, from the initial confrontation to this final resolution. She said it was one of the most impressive displays of quiet strength she had ever seen. Marcus had won without ever raising his voice, without ever showing anger, without ever compromising his principles. Marcus processed the sergeant's paperwork that afternoon with the same careful attention he gave to every request that crossed his desk. The fee waivers were properly authorized, the expedited processing was justified and documented, and everything was handled exactly according to regulations. By 5 o'clock, the entire matter was complete and filed appropriately. That evening, Marcus went home to his small apartment, feeling satisfied in a way that had nothing to do with defeating anyone or proving anyone wrong. He had simply done his job correctly, maintained his integrity under pressure, and trusted that following proper procedures would ultimately lead to the right outcome. The satisfaction came from staying true to his principles even when it would have been easier to compromise. The story could have ended there, a simple tale of proper procedures prevailing over attempted intimidation. But the ripples from this incident were just beginning to spread through both the municipal office and the military base, creating consequences that no one had anticipated. The following week brought unexpected visitors to Marcus's office. Captain Morrison returned, but this time he was accompanied by a civilian woman in a professional pantsuit who introduced herself as Jennifer Walsh from the city's Human Resources Department. David was immediately called into the meeting, his face showing concern that this situation was somehow escalating again despite the apparent resolution. Jennifer Walsh explained that the incident between Marcus and Sergeant Hutchinson had triggered a broader review of procedures across multiple municipal departments. When the mayor's office had initially received the sergeant's complaints, several officials had been ready to take action against Marcus without fully investigating the situation. Captain Morrison's intervention had prevented that, but it had also revealed a troubling pattern. The HR director had discovered that this was not an isolated incident. Over the past 2 years, there had been 17 similar complaints filed against various municipal employees by individuals attempting to bypass established procedures. In most of those cases, the employees had been disciplined or transferred, and the complainants had received the expedited treatment they demanded. Regardless of whether proper authorization existed, Marcus listened with growing understanding. His refusal to back down had inadvertently exposed a systemic problem. The city had been rewarding people who complained loudly and intimidated employees, while punishing those employees who tried to follow proper procedures. This had created an environment where rules were treated as suggestions rather than requirements, applicable only when convenient. Captain Morrison added his perspective. When he had investigated Sergeant Hutchinson's complaints, he had discovered that the sergeant had used similar tactics successfully in the past, both on the military base and in civilian offices. Each time his intimidation worked, it reinforced his belief that proper procedures did not apply to him. Marcus was apparently the first person who had refused to be moved, and that refusal had been instructive in ways that went beyond this single incident. Jennifer Walsh then delivered news that surprised everyone in the room. The mayor's office, after reviewing the situation thoroughly, had decided to implement new policies across all municipal departments. Employees would be specifically protected and supported when upholding proper procedures, even if it meant dealing with difficult or influential complainants. There would be mandatory training for supervisors on backing up their staff in these situations. Moreover, Jennifer continued, the city wanted to recognize employees who demonstrated the kind of integrity and professionalism that Marcus had shown. They were creating a commendation program, and Marcus would be the first recipient. The recognition would be formally presented at the next city council meeting, which would be attended by various department heads, elected officials, and members of the community. David looked stunned. His earlier worry transformed into amazement. He had been expecting potential fallout and had instead received news that his clerk was being held up as an example of excellence. Marcus himself remained characteristically calm, though he admitted feeling somewhat overwhelmed by the attention. He had simply been doing his job correctly, nothing more. Captain Morrison smiled at this response. He told Marcus that the military would also be implementing changes based on this incident. New protocols were being established for how service members were expected to interact with civilian offices and agencies. Sergeant Hutchinson would be leading a training program on proper procedures and respectful conduct, using his own experience as a cautionary tale. The irony of this was not lost on anyone in the room. The sergeant who had tried to intimidate Marcus into breaking the rules would now be teaching others why following those rules was important. Captain Morrison acknowledged that it was a form of redemption for Hutchinson, an opportunity to transform his mistake into something constructive. Over the next few weeks, Marcus found himself in an unexpectedly prominent position. The city council meeting where he received his commendation was attended by far more people than usual. Many of them municipal employees who had heard about the incident through office gossip and wanted to see the clerk who had stood up to pressure from above and below. The mayor herself presented the award, speaking about the importance of integrity in public service and the courage it took to uphold standards even when facing intimidation. She made it clear that the city valued employees like Marcus who understood that rules existed for good reasons and that fair application of those rules protected everyone. In the audience, Marcus spotted Sergeant Hutchinson in civilian clothes, sitting quietly in the back row. Their eyes met briefly, and the sergeant gave a small nod of acknowledgement. There was no animosity in the gesture, only a recognition of lessons learned on both sides. Marcus nodded back. After the ceremony, several employees from different departments approached Marcus. They thanked him quietly, some with voices thick with emotion. They shared their own stories of being pressured to bend rules, of being punished for trying to do things correctly, of feeling alone and unsupported when they attempted to maintain standards. Marcus's stand had apparently given them hope that integrity could be rewarded rather than punished. One older woman from the permits office gripped Marcus's hand tightly. She told him that she had been on the verge of early retirement because she was tired of being caught between doing things right and keeping difficult people happy. Seeing Marcus's recognition had changed her mind. If the city was truly committed to supporting employees who upheld procedures, she wanted to stay and be part of that culture. Sarah attended the ceremony as well, sitting in the front row and beaming with pride. Afterward, she teased Marcus about being famous, but her words carried genuine warmth. She told him that she had learned something important by watching how he handled the situation. Staying calm and sticking to your principles did not mean being inflexible or difficult. It meant being clear about what was right and unwilling to compromise those standards for convenience. David also approached Marcus after the ceremony, and for the first time since the incident began, he looked completely relaxed. He apologized for not supporting Marcus more strongly from the beginning, for allowing political pressure to make him doubt whether backing his employee was the right choice. Marcus assured him that he understood the difficult position supervisors faced, and that what mattered was how things had ultimately been resolved. Jennifer Walsh from HR pulled Marcus aside before he left. She told him that the new policies being implemented were largely inspired by his example, but they needed more than just policies. They needed training materials, real examples to show employees what proper conduct looked like under pressure. She asked if Marcus would be willing to participate in developing these training programs, sharing his approach to handling difficult situations. Marcus agreed, though he emphasized that he did not consider himself an expert or someone who had all the answers. He had simply tried to do his job correctly and had been fortunate enough to have the situation resolve in his favor. Jennifer smiled and said that humility was part of what made his example so powerful. People could relate to someone who was just trying to do the right thing, not someone who positioned themselves as superior or unflappable. The following months brought gradual changes to the office culture. Employees seemed more confident in upholding procedures, and supervisors were quicker to back them up when challenges arose. There were still difficult situations and unhappy customers, but the atmosphere had shifted. Rules were no longer treated as obstacles to be avoided, but as frameworks that protected everyone involved. Sergeant Hutchinson completed his training program development and, surprisingly, requested another meeting with Marcus. When they sat down together in a quiet coffee shop near the municipal building, the sergeant looked different. The aggressive edge that had defined their first encounters was completely gone, replaced by a more thoughtful demeanor. The sergeant explained that developing the training materials had forced him to really examine his own behavior and attitudes. He had spent years believing that his rank entitled him to special treatment, that rules were for other people to follow while he focused on more important matters. Marcus's refusal to accept that worldview had been a wake-up call he needed, but had not wanted. Marcus listened without judgment. He told the sergeant that everyone had moments where they prioritized convenience over correctness, where they convinced themselves that bending rules was justified by their circumstances. The key was recognizing those moments and choosing differently. The sergeant had done that, and his willingness to teach others showed real growth. Their conversation continued for over an hour, two veterans from different branches and different eras finding common ground in shared experiences and hard-learned wisdom. When they finally parted ways, there was genuine mutual respect between them, forged not through their initial conflict, but through the growth that followed it. Marcus returned to his office that afternoon, feeling satisfied in a deeper way than he had after the commendation ceremony. Recognition and awards were nice, but this conversation had confirmed something more important. Real change was possible. People could learn, grow, and transform their worst moments into opportunities for improvement. The system could work when people committed to making it work properly. That evening, as Marcus organized his desk before heading home, he reflected on how much had changed in just a few months. He was still the same person doing the same job in the same small office, yet everything felt different. The culture had shifted, the expectations had evolved, and people approached their work with renewed purpose and confidence. Sarah stopped by his desk on her way out. She mentioned that she had been offered a promotion to a supervisor position in another department. She was nervous about accepting it, worried about the challenges of managing people and navigating difficult situations. Marcus encouraged her to take the opportunity. He reminded her that she had witnessed firsthand how staying true to principles and supporting your team could lead to positive outcomes. She had learned those lessons just as he had. As Marcus locked the office doors and walked to his car in the parking lot, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. The day had been ordinary in many ways, filled with routine tasks and standard procedures. But Marcus had learned that ordinary work done with integrity and care could have extraordinary impact when it mattered most. He thought about Sergeant Hutchinson, about David, about all the employees who had approached him after the ceremony with their stories. He thought about Jennifer Walsh developing new policies and Sarah preparing to become a supervisor. All these people, connected by a single moment when someone had simply refused to compromise on doing things correctly. Marcus drove home knowing that Monday would bring new challenges, new visitors to his counter, new situations requiring judgment and patience. Some would be routine, others might test him again, but he was ready for whatever came next, armed with the confidence that came from knowing he could trust himself to do the right thing, even when pressured to do otherwise. The story that had begun with a confrontation over paperwork had transformed into something much larger. It had become a reminder that ordinary people in ordinary jobs had the power to change systems, to influence culture, and to inspire others simply by refusing to accept that wrong was acceptable, just because it was easier. As Marcus unlocked his apartment door and stepped inside, he felt grateful. Not for the recognition or the commendation, but for the opportunity to work in a place where integrity mattered, where growth was possible, and where a simple clerk could make a difference by asking one straightforward question when it counted most. Could you help? Yes, but only the right way. That had been his answer, and it had changed everything. 6 months after the initial incident, the changes that had begun in Marcus's small office had rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted. The new policies Jennifer Walsh had implemented were now standard across all municipal departments, and the training program Marcus had helped develop was being rolled out to every city employee who dealt with the public. Marcus found himself in an unusual position. He was still a records clerk, still doing the same fundamental job he had always done, but now supervisors from other departments occasionally asked him to sit in on difficult meetings or consult when procedural questions arose. His reputation as someone who could remain calm under pressure while upholding standards had spread throughout the municipal system. The change was not just limited to the city government. Captain Morrison had kept Marcus informed about developments at the military base. The training program Sergeant Hutchinson had developed, initially mandated only for his unit, had been expanded base-wide after senior commanders reviewed its content and impact. Several officers had specifically commended the program for addressing issues they had struggled with for years. One Tuesday morning, nearly identical in weather and feel to the morning when Sergeant Hutchinson had first walked through the door, Marcus noticed an unfamiliar woman standing near the entrance. She appeared uncertain, holding a folder close to her chest and looking around the office as if trying to determine where to go. Marcus recognized the body language of someone intimidated by bureaucracy and unsure of the reception they would receive. He smiled and called out gently, asking if he could help her. The woman approached his counter hesitantly. She explained that she was new to the city and needed to file several documents related to starting a small business. She apologized in advance for probably not having everything in order, for taking up too much time, for being confused about the process. Her anxiety was evident in every word. Marcus took his time with her, explaining each step clearly and without rushing. When she was missing a required form, he did not simply tell her to come back later. Instead, he showed her where to find the form online, helped her understand what information she needed to provide, and assured her that these requirements existed to protect her business interests, not to create obstacles. The woman's relief was visible. She thanked Marcus multiple times, mentioning that she had been dreading this visit because she had heard government offices were difficult and unwelcoming. Marcus's patience and clear explanations had transformed her expectation into a positive experience. As she left with everything properly filed and a clear understanding of next steps, Marcus felt the familiar satisfaction of helping someone navigate the system successfully. This interaction represented the daily reality of what had changed. Marcus was still enforcing the same rules, still requiring proper documentation, still following procedures exactly. But the culture around those procedures had shifted. They were presented as helpful guidelines rather than arbitrary barriers, and employees felt supported in taking the time to explain and assist, rather than simply rejecting incomplete applications. David stopped by Marcus's desk later that morning with news. The city manager had reviewed the metrics from the past 6 months and found something remarkable. Despite the new emphasis on following procedures strictly, or perhaps because of it, customer satisfaction scores had actually increased significantly. Processing times had improved. Errors and complaints about unfair treatment had dropped dramatically. The data confirmed what Marcus had always believed. Proper procedures, consistently applied and clearly explained, actually served customers better than the old system of inconsistent rule bending. When everyone knew that the same standards applied to everyone, there was less frustration, fewer accusations of favoritism, and more trust in the system overall. David also shared that he had been promoted to a regional supervisor position, overseeing multiple municipal offices. The promotion was partly based on the successful implementation of the new policies in his department. He wanted Marcus to know that he would be recommending Marcus for the office manager position that would become vacant when David moved to his new role. Marcus was surprised by this news. He had never particularly aspired to management, content in his role as a clerk. David anticipated this hesitation and addressed it directly. He told Marcus that leadership was not about seeking power or recognition. It was about setting an example, supporting your team, and ensuring that the right things got done for the right reasons. Marcus had been demonstrating those qualities all along without trying to be a leader. That was exactly why he would be good at it. Over the next few weeks, Marcus considered the opportunity. He spoke with Sarah, who had thrived in her supervisor role, and encouraged him to accept the position. He talked with other colleagues who assured him they would value having a manager who understood their work and would support them in doing it correctly. Even some customers who had become regulars over the years urged him to take the promotion, saying the office needed someone like him in charge. The decision was not easy. Marcus genuinely enjoyed the direct work of processing applications and helping individuals. Management would mean less of that personal interaction and more administrative responsibility, but he also recognized that the changes they had started could be strengthened and expanded with the right leadership. If he truly believed in the importance of proper procedures and supportive culture, stepping into a role where he could institutionalize those values made sense. Marcus accepted the promotion. His first day as office manager came with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. He found himself sitting in David's former office, looking out at the same space he had occupied for years from a different angle. The view reminded him that perspective changed depending on where you stood, but principles remained constant regardless of position. His first challenge as manager came sooner than expected. A city councilman appeared in the office demanding immediate processing of multiple permits for a property development project. The councilman was used to receiving priority treatment and made it clear that he expected Marcus to expedite everything without the usual review process. Several employees watched nervously, wondering how their new manager would handle his first test. Marcus listened politely to the councilman's demands, then calmly explained the standard timeline for permit review and the reasons those timelines existed. He assured the councilman that his applications would receive thorough and fair consideration, along with all other pending applications. The procedures were designed to ensure proper safety reviews and community input, protecting both the developer and the public interest. The councilman was clearly unused to being told no, even politely. He threatened to call the city manager, to complain to the mayor, to make trouble for Marcus's fledgling management career. Marcus remained perfectly calm, exactly as he had with Sergeant Hutchinson months earlier. He assured the councilman that he was welcome to contact anyone he wished, but that the procedures would be followed regardless of who made the request. After the councilman left, Marcus noticed the employees exchanging glances. Sarah, now a supervisor herself, approached with a knowing smile. She told Marcus that word would spread quickly about how he had handled his first difficult situation as manager. The message was clear. The culture they had been building would continue. Rules would be followed, Pressure would not change proper procedures, and employees would be supported in doing their jobs correctly. That evening, Marcus received a phone call from Jennifer Walsh. The city manager had indeed been contacted by the councilman, just as threatened. But instead of creating problems for Marcus, the complaint had been dismissed immediately. The city manager had personally reviewed Marcus's handling of the situation and commended him for maintaining the standards that had been making such positive differences across municipal departments. Jennifer told Marcus something else that surprised him. The councilman's complaint had actually triggered a review of his other interactions with city employees. It turned out he had a pattern of demanding special treatment and had successfully intimidated several employees over the years. Thanks to Marcus's refusal to bend the rules, that pattern was now being addressed at higher levels. Marcus hung up the phone and sat quietly in his living room, reflecting on the strange journey that had begun with one confrontational encounter. That single moment when he had refused to be intimidated, when he had insisted on following proper procedures despite pressure and threats, had set in motion changes that continued to expand and deepen. 1 year after the incident with Sergeant Hutchinson, Marcus sat in a conference room with department heads from across the city government. They had gathered to review the outcomes of the policy changes and training programs that had been implemented following that pivotal confrontation. The results, compiled in detailed reports, painted a remarkable picture of transformation. Customer satisfaction scores had risen by 32% across all municipal offices. Employee retention had improved significantly, with far fewer workers requesting transfers or leaving their positions due to stress. Processing errors had dropped by nearly half, saving the city both money and legal liability. Perhaps most striking, complaints about unfair treatment or inconsistent application of rules had decreased by over 60%. The city manager stood at the front of the room, presenting these findings with visible pride. She acknowledged that the changes had not been easy. Some influential people had been unhappy about losing their ability to bypass procedures through pressure or connections. There had been resistance from employees accustomed to the old ways. But the data demonstrated conclusively that the new approach served everyone better, from city staff to ordinary citizens seeking services. The city manager then asked Marcus to address the group. She wanted him to share his perspective on what had made the changes successful and what challenges remained. Marcus stood somewhat reluctantly, still uncomfortable with being positioned as an expert or leader in these discussions. But he understood the value of sharing honest observations from someone who worked daily at the ground level of implementation. Marcus spoke about the importance of consistency. He explained that rules only worked when everyone, from the newest clerk to the most senior official, followed them equally. The moment exceptions were made based on someone's status or influence, the entire system lost credibility. Employees needed to know they would be supported when they upheld standards, even against difficult opposition. That support had to be real, not just policy language on paper. He also addressed the balance between following procedures and serving people well. Some worried that strict adherence to rules would make city offices cold and unwelcoming, but Marcus's experience showed the opposite. When rules were applied consistently and explained clearly, people appreciated the fairness and transparency. The key was helping people work within the procedures rather than seeing the procedures as obstacles to overcome. After Marcus finished speaking, several department heads asked questions and shared their own experiences implementing similar approaches. One mentioned that she had faced a situation almost identical to Marcus's encounter with the sergeant, and remembering his example had helped her stay calm and firm. Another described how his team's morale had improved dramatically once employees felt protected when doing their jobs correctly. Near the end of the meeting, an unexpected visitor arrived. Captain Morrison entered the conference room accompanied by Sergeant Hutchinson. The captain had been invited to provide the military's perspective on the training program and cultural changes that had occurred on the base. Everyone in the room turned to listen, curious about developments on the military side. Captain Morrison explained that the changes implemented at the base had produced results similar to those in the city government. Relationships between military personnel and civilian offices had improved. Complaints about military members attempting to bypass procedures had virtually disappeared. Most significantly, The base commander had expanded the training program to address other areas where procedures were sometimes treated casually or selectively applied. Then Captain Morrison did something unexpected. He asked Sergeant Hutchinson to speak. The sergeant stood clearly nervous about addressing this group of civilian officials and department heads. He began by acknowledging his role in starting this entire process. Though not in a way he had intended or could be proud of initially, Sergeant Hutchinson described his initial encounter with Marcus honestly, not glossing over his own aggressive behavior and sense of entitlement. He explained how he had genuinely believed that his rank meant rules should bend for him, that procedures were inconveniences to be bypassed rather than guidelines to be followed. Marcus's calm refusal to accept that worldview had forced him to confront attitudes he had held for years. The sergeant then detailed his journey of developing the training program, which had required him to research why procedures existed and what happened when they were ignored or applied inconsistently. That research had been eye-opening. He discovered that many of the regulations he had dismissed as bureaucratic nonsense actually protected people, prevented corruption, and ensured fair treatment. Understanding the purpose behind the rules had changed his entire perspective. Sergeant Hutchinson concluded by thanking Marcus directly. He said that having someone stand firm against his intimidation, someone who maintained professionalism while refusing to compromise, had been the catalyst he needed for genuine personal growth. It had not felt like a gift at the time, but looking back, Marcus had done him a favor by not taking the easy path of simply giving in to make an angry person go away. The room fell silent after the sergeant finished speaking. Then the city manager began applauding and others joined in. It was not applause for a performance or presentation, but recognition of genuine transformation and the courage it took to acknowledge past mistakes publicly. After the meeting concluded, Marcus found himself approached by various officials wanting to continue conversations or share their own stories, but he made his way through the crowd to where Sergeant Hutchinson stood, somewhat apart from the others. They shook hands and Marcus thanked him for his honesty in the presentation. The sergeant replied that honesty was the least he could offer, after everything that had happened. They talked briefly about their current work and the changes they had witnessed. The sergeant mentioned that he would be retiring from military service in another year, and he was considering what to do next. Marcus suggested that his experience developing and teaching about proper procedures might translate well to civilian training or organizational consulting. People and organizations needed to hear from someone who had learned these lessons the hard way and could speak authentically about the journey. As evening approached, and people began leaving the conference center, Marcus walked out with Sarah. She had been promoted again and now oversaw multiple departments, implementing the same supportive culture they had pioneered in their original office. She remarked that it was amazing how far things had come from that one Tuesday morning, when an angry sergeant had slammed a door and tried to intimidate a clerk. Marcus agreed, but he also noted that the change had not really started with that confrontation. It had started with a decision he made long before, a decision to do his job correctly regardless of pressure or convenience. The encounter with Sergeant Hutchinson had simply been the moment when that decision became visible and consequential. The real foundation was the commitment to integrity that existed before anyone was watching or testing it. Sarah asked Marcus if he ever regretted his choice to stand firm that day, knowing how much stress and uncertainty it had caused. Marcus considered the question carefully. He admitted there had been moments of doubt, times when he wondered if he was being unnecessary, stubborn or creating problems that could have been avoided, but ultimately he did not regret it. The outcome had validated his belief that doing the right thing, even when difficult, led to better results than taking shortcuts or compromising principles for temporary peace. They reached the parking lot and paused before heading to their separate vehicles. Sarah told Marcus something she had never shared before. On that first day when Sergeant Hutchinson had been so aggressive and threatening, she had been ready to intervene. She had her hand on the phone, prepared to call security if things escalated physically. But watching Marcus remain so calm and composed, she had realized something important. The best response to aggression was not more aggression or fear, but steady adherence to what was right. That realization, Sarah said, had influenced every difficult situation she had faced since then in her supervisor and management roles. When people tried to intimidate, when they threatened complaints or consequences, She thought of Marcus calmly explaining procedures and refusing to be moved. That example had been more valuable than any training manual or policy document. Marcus drove home that evening with a deep sense of satisfaction. Not because of recognition or praise, though he appreciated both, but because the choice he had made 1 year ago to simply do his job correctly had created ripples that continued to spread and deepen. People were being treated more fairly. Employees felt more supported. Systems were working better, all because someone had asked for help, and Marcus had responded with a simple principle. Yes, he could help, but only by following the proper procedures that protected everyone involved. His apartment was quiet when he arrived, a peaceful refuge after the busy day. Marcus made himself dinner and sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker on as darkness fell. He thought about all the people whose lives had intersected with his because of one moment of decision. The sergeant who had learned and grown, the employees who felt empowered, the customers who received fair treatment, the systems that functioned with greater integrity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be difficult people, complex situations, moments requiring judgment and courage. But Marcus felt ready for whatever came next. He had learned that ordinary people in ordinary jobs possessed extraordinary power when they chose to act with integrity, even when easier paths beckoned. The story that had begun with a confrontation had transformed into something much larger than any of the participants could have imagined. It had become a testament to the power of principles, the importance of consistency, and the ripple effects of simple courage. Marcus had defeated Sergeant Hutchinson not through superior force or clever tactics, but through the simple act of remaining true to what was right when pressure mounted to compromise. As Marcus prepared for bed that night, he reflected on the title that Jennifer Walsh had jokingly suggested for his story, if it was ever written down. "Could you help?" she had said. It captured everything perfectly. Someone had asked for help and Marcus had provided it, just not in the way they initially wanted. Real help meant doing things correctly, following procedures that protected everyone, and refusing to enable behavior that would ultimately cause problems. The lights in Marcus's apartment went dark, but across the city and on the military base, the changes sparked by his decision continued to influence how people worked, how they treated each other, and how systems functioned. A single clerk had remained calm, upheld standards, and trusted that integrity would prevail. And it had.